Hi everyone, Grover from headphones.com here, and today we're going to be talking about the Burson Funk. The Burson Funk is a very interesting and new class of desktop headphone amplifier that also includes a speaker tap on the back. What makes this special is that it is not only a 3 watt per channel, quite powerful headphone amplifier, it's also a speaker amplifier. So I believe Cord has a version of this, and there might be 1 or 2 other companies that are coming out with similar products. But essentially it's meant to be an all-in-one desktop amplifier that you can use if you have speakers that are passive and need a power amplifier, as well as for typical headphones like dynamics or planars. It also comes in at a very reasonable price point. It's under $1,000, and I think that makes it one of the higher value proposition devices in the market. The functionality is relatively straightforward. You've got power button, high and low gain settings, and a switch that switches between the speaker outputs and the headphone outputs. One functionality that wasn't on this unit that I would have liked to have seen would have been another set of RCA outputs that had a bypass switch, so you could either run a subwoofer or so that you could plug in a set of active monitors if you do not in fact have passive speakers. On the back, we have our final very interesting addition, which is actually a microphone jack. Now I did test this out. It's not super fancy, but it gets the job done. And I think this really speaks to what Burson has done with making a very functional unit here. This is a great all-in-one desktop unit, and the functionality and inputs and outputs are generally quite well thought out. With the aforementioned RCA outputs being absent, you can still use it on a wide variety of speakers, so it's not too big of a deal, but it is something that I would have liked to have seen, and I would possibly like to see in future versions of this product. In terms of build quality, if you're familiar with the Burson products, this is fairly standard. It's got their heat-sinked external chassis. It feels hefty in the hands. It's well built. It's not extremely heavy, but it feels substantial, and the volume knob turns nicely, and everything feels like it's pretty solid and secure. This also, I believe, can make use of Burson's op-amp swap capability. So I didn't have any op-amps to try in this unit while I was here, but I've heard from many of my friends and other folks that the op-amp swapping can offer a really great and creative degree of tuning the amplifier to your specific sound preferences. So if you do like to swap things out, get different sounds, that's something you can do with this amplifier as well. Overall, the theme of this box is flexibility, so great inputs and outputs. If you want to swap out the op-amps, you can do that and get different sounds. I didn't have any of those here with me, so I couldn't test that out, but it is something that you can do if you would like to get a different sound out of this amplifier. I'll focus primarily on the headphone output, as I believe that's what's going to be most relevant to most of you. However, I will say that the speaker output did function well. It sounded nice. It had a slight warm bent to it, and that I was surprised by how much power it had. Burson lists 45 watts per channel in Class AB, not Class D, surprisingly, for this amplifier, and it definitely sounds nice. It's smooth. It's got a slight warmth to it, as I mentioned before, and it does not distort when you push it at the highest levels, even with relatively inefficient speakers. This was capable of driving speakers, even in the mid-80s, to relatively satisfying listening levels on a desktop. For the true serious 2-channel audiophile, there's going to be things that are a lot more substantial sounding than this. However, if you happen to have a pair of old CAFs lying around, or you happen to have a modest pair of passive speakers, ELAC, something like that, this is going to do a great job with them. And especially in that near field situation, this kind of sound is going to offer a lot. I was surprised by the amount of power that was on tap and how little distortion there was, especially for a near field experience. It was very satisfying. In terms of the headphone output, this amp sounds a lot like other Burson amplifiers if you're familiar with their sound. There's a kind of warmth to it that expresses itself not as a frequency response anomaly, but as a kind of sort of gentle rounding of transients in the mid-range and treble. It definitely feels a little bit rolled off in the treble as compared to the Jotunheim that I have here from Shit Audio, or my SPL Phonitor, for example. but that's not to say that it's a super dark amplifier, only that it seems to have a little bit of a rounded transient and warmer tilt in the high regions. Now, in terms of the bass and the lower mid-range, these are pretty clean and punchy. They may not be quite as impactful or crazy dynamic as some, but they're relatively clean, neutral, they sound good for solid state, and as I mentioned before, they combine nicely with that high region smoothness to create a very warm effect. If you're using a pair of Utopias, for example, as I was primarily during this review, they definitely rounded off and made the upper treble of the Utopia quite a bit warmer. So if you tend to find that a bright headphone, this would be a really nice pairing to really shave off a little bit of that information on top. Compared with other headphones, I found pairings with ZMF were very successful with this. I did, for example, really like it with the Verite headphones. I wasn't a huge fan of it, surprisingly, on planars. There was plenty of power on tap, but my Odyssey headphones, for example, didn't sing as much in the treble as I would have liked. There just wasn't as much detail in the treble between the slightly rolled, sort of rounded sound of this and some of the lack of energy with some of those headphones of the planar magnetic variety in the upper ranges. So it wasn't my favorite pairing, but it did power them very, very well, and the bass was excellent. I tend to use EQ to address larger frequency response anomalies, so if you don't use EQ, this amplifier might be a great way of getting a headphone that you like, but find a little too bright in the upper registers to be really smooth up there and to suit your preferences more. If you do use EQ, do know that this headphone amplifier does tend to have that more rounded, sort of rolled off sound in the upper treble, and it will present a slightly warmer, slightly more diffuse soundstage up there. So good choice, whether or not you EQ, but it definitely has a very specific frequency tilt to it. In terms of detail, scale, soundstage, dynamics, all of those intangibles, I thought this was great. If you are used to, again, that Burson sound, it's got a slight warmth, a slight punchiness to it, and it's fairly detailed, although it's not necessarily the most incisive amplifier out there. This is, again, going to be a great choice, and it really is competitive with other Burson products and other products at this price range. If we're looking at things around or under $1,000, this is much more competitive than, say, an RME ADI2. I found that the headphone amplifier out of this unit, obviously there's no DAC, but the headphone amplifier is quite a bit more substantial than something like the RME or something like the Phonitor 1D. It was much more to my preference, had a lot more power, and definitely presented a more engaging, more dynamic sense of head stage. For the price, I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find a headphone amplifier that specifically does better than this, unless you're looking for something that is brighter, a tube amp, things like that. It's a really, really solid headphone amplifier for the price, and add in the speaker taps, and you've got an extremely powerful desktop unit. I have to also mention that Burson did a great job of keeping the form factor trim, but not too small. It fits really, really well with the longer and deeper form factor on a great many desks, rather than having the wider form factor, which can sometimes take up too much space. This is a case in which the live with it and usability factor are so high that combined with it sounding really, really great on top of that, I can see this being a total endgame unit for a lot of people. Again, as a desktop unit for people who aren't searching for the absolute last word in total detail or looking for an expensive tube amplifier, for example. Again, if you have thoughts on rolling op amps in the Burson Funk, I would love to hear what those are. Leave a comment on the video or go to the headphones.com forums and let me know what you thought. This amplifier has excited me a lot, and I'm really, really intrigued by the new category of desktop speaker and headphone amplifier. Definitely encourage you to give this one a try if you've not laid ears on it yet, and I look forward to trying out more of this class of amplifier.